Good morning, everyone. I apologize for my voice being a bit froggy, but I think I will make it through this presentation. I want to thank again the American Alliance of Museums and TIPA for such a leadership role in this convening. I know that you've heard this from many people and these acknowledgments in many ways. But for me, this convening is really a call to action. It's a commitment that we're not going to do our work in the same ways we have historically done them. Work that is, in a sense, divided in silos of content type, or class, or location, or specialization, or gender, or race. Coming through this conference, through this convening, I feel very encouraged that we can grapple with very messy issues that are not resolved yet, and that we can share our authority with each other and with our audiences as well, those whom we serve. The institution that I serve, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, is the result of 100 years of petitioning to the US Congress. The US Congress authorized this museum in 1917. When we open next year, precisely 1 year from now, it will be 100 years since we've been able to accomplish this museum. And it's largely through the will of the people, not only African American people, but the nation writ large, and beyond. Our museum is not only art or history or community stories, but all of those things. And the organization of our museum is the result of an initial 2 years of going around the country and asking people what did they want, what did they need to know, and in what ways did they need to know it, what forms. Instead of having an intellectual or academic or curatorial approach that drove everything, those resources and skills and tools were put in service of responding to people's wishes. What I'm going to do as part of this presentation is not an overview of the museum, but instead will be just some indications of the kinds of mixtures of elements that we have in our museum. In addition, the museum, especially through the unit that I am charged with, is constantly working with local, regional, and other organizations. And so we do not expect that we are the ultimate story on the National Mall at the foot of the Washington Monument. But instead, if people come to our museum, we redirect visitors back out into all of our communities around the country. And we have techniques for doing that, geotagging, et cetera. But the point is that these stories that we can tell on the mall are one small slice. We can tell some national stories, but for visitors to understand the realities on the ground, both historical and contemporary, they need to go to those places and they need to speak with those people. One of the first issues that we dealt with, and this is a quote from James Baldwin, the famous African-American writer and intellectual, is that African-American presence is 500 years easily in this hemisphere. It was not voluntary, and we of course are exceeded by our native peoples, First Nations, indigenous peoples throughout the hemisphere. Our history, however, is not only that, and one of the issues that I've heard repeatedly in the sessions that I've been convening or I've been participating in is that this is not a story of victimhood, and it's not one of singing and dancing. It's the entire range of our experience. And so much of what we do is to highlight in various media those African Americans that produce all kinds of culture and history and stories in ways that are often unknown to even our own US publics. This car is the red Cadillac that belonged to Chubby Checkers, and he had a song about his red Cadillac. We also have a lot of stories about memory, our recent past, our remote past. You should know that our museum began with 0 collections. Unlike many of the Smithsonian museums, We did not inherit or take on other collections. And so our curators, our educators, et cetera, have spent the last 10 years in collaboration with our communities, bringing collections into the museum. And it's been largely voluntary. Unlike other Smithsonian museums that are art museums, we do not have the money to buy very high-end pieces of art. And so many of the finest pieces we have been given to us by collectors. Our sports stories, and this was a little unusual for us, there were requests by communities that we cover the military experience and the role of sports in our museum. But not because it was about awards, not because it was about specific matches, but because African American engagement in sports has historically been one way of proving oneself, of proving excellence, of proving the right to citizenship, full citizenship. And the same with our military stories, that in having a willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice, and in World War I, in the Civil War, in World War I, in World War II, African Americans served the US military to obtain rights for people overseas or elsewhere that they did not have even at home in their own countries. Much of our museum's impetus, the founding of this museum, begins with that. These were, the museum's request for creation is a result of World War I, where returning veterans and their constituents and their communities went to the Congress and said, we have served like all have served. Why are we invisible? Why are we invisible in public history and public culture? The US Congress authorized a museum in 1917, but did not provide any funding for it until 90 years later. In our museums, as federal or national museums, 1/2 of the cost of the museum comes from the money of the people. All of our taxes, all of our money is a contribution to the creation of this museum. But the other half is our private fundraising, and we've been, I must say, very, very successful. We are telling stories that are often unknown, in places unknown. The African American experience in the West and in being part of the Western expansion is a series of stories. But those stories begin in the 1470s as an accompaniment with the Spanish explorers. We also have an entire series of exhibitions and programs that relate to the everyday, how our culture is also the product of everyday work and life, etc. And actually on the left is a boat seat. It is the very first object that was accessioned into our collections. And it's from Ecuador, from Esmeraldas. And this was provided to the museum by a community that said, we connect with you. We understand these diasporic connections. While we are not in the United States, we are all linked. Our foodways, our artistic production, all of these things in an everyday way that you still can see every day in every place is a core part of our exhibitions. The museum was formally inaugurated in 2006 with Lonnie Bunch, our founding director, coming on as the first employee. We are now at approximately 150 staff, contractors, curators, educators, IT specialists, finance specialists, etc. But one of our goals that we are always aware of is that we must be constantly engaged with our communities around the country on the ground. To that end, many of our initiatives are partnerships with pre-existing organizations. We have partnered with the National Trust for Historic Preservation in a special initiative to preserve African American historic places, what I think of as place-based history and culture. A lot of our work is also highlighting the work of people who have changed the American landscape. And this is actually a photograph of the master blacksmith, Mr. Philip Simmons, who died approximately 5 years ago. If you've ever visited Charleston, South Carolina, which is known for its architecture, its wrought iron work, its foodways, et cetera. All of that, the reason that Charleston looks the way it does, the food that people eat, is overwhelmingly African American. And in our work, you may see a piece or two and storylines on the National Mall, but we redirect you back to his blacksmith shop. We redirect you back to in a walking trail where you can see some 75 pieces of work that he created in the 20th century. We also profile places of recreation and leisure. As I said in the very beginning, this is not a story of perpetual victimhood and sadness. There were places of recreation, segregated recreation, and one of our main lines is that while African Americans were historically not permitted to be part of public beaches, public parks, recreational sites, fabulous hotels, we created our own. And that creation of separate institutions, including institutions of higher education, is an ongoing feature that we highlight, preserve, and use even today. This is a school that was built by this particular community in 1940. With the desegregation of schools, this school was closed by force by the state government of South Carolina. The alumni and graduates of this school have reinvigorated this as now a community health center, a community history center, et cetera. And this is one of the ways in which we are engaged in ongoing work around the country. Many of our sites are also not buildings and not collections, but instead living culture. And so, for instance, on your left, there is an African-American heritage trail in Louisiana of some 28 sites. These are places, events, et cetera, that visitors to Louisiana can follow and can, in whichever ways they are going, but that highlight the African-American presence in contemporary terms, historical terms. On the right is actually one of a series of now 400 markers, interactive markers, called the Mississippi Blues Trail, that highlights this cultural form that is a unique African-American form that is now popular around the world. The markers began as a series of interpretive signs for people explicitly who would never, ever enter a museum. We know that many people do not trust museums. They do not see themselves in museums. And so this was a project funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. One might encounter a marker in the middle of a cotton field or on the side of a highway or next to a restaurant. And it actually now extends beyond Mississippi into 12 states. There are also markers in Norway, in London, in Paris, and in the Caribbean. This is an example of some of our partnership with the B.B. King Museum and Delta Interpretive Center, located in a community of 12,000 people in the middle of the Mississippi Delta. 60% of that population lives under the poverty level. We worked with the B.B. King Museum, and they reimagined a place of community history and memory, but also a place of contemporary culture production, of health and wellness education. And like us, they report to their community on an ongoing basis. And this is actually a structure that was a brick cotton gin, so very much like the structure we are in right now. We do a lot of work with repurposing historical structures for completely new uses and for contemporary communities. We've also been approached, we are very active in participating with the Black Lives Matter movement, which is currently going on, as many of you may know, in the United States. We perceive it as another wave of civil rights activism for this century and this youngest generation. In fact, Lonnie Bunch, our director, was asked, why do you bother with this? You're the Smithsonian. You don't have to get engaged in these issues. And he has said, because it's the right thing to do, and it's because of who we are. This is another photo of the canoe seat, which was on top of a canoe in the Esmeraldas region. I think many of you are familiar with Juan Garcia Salazar, who is a famous community scholar and public intellectual. And he brought this to our attention. He donated it, and this was something created by his grandmother and used for 3 generations. And one of the reasons that we were very happy to obtain it is because it reflects the Anansi the spider motif in the center. This was a motif that that community identified as such. We did not, in a sense, say, we are going to name this. We see our own motifs. We were informed and instructed by that community of how it is relevant. Among our recent art acquisitions, the Colombian artist Ana Mercedes Ollas is a very well-known photographer and painter, and we have materials from her, both photography and lithographic artwork as part of what we do. Much of what we are doing right now in our core collecting is really within the United States, but we already have expanded beyond into the Caribbean, Central America, South America, Canada, and we are working in Africa as well. This is an actual research project in which my unit is involved. We have a major research initiative which is documenting shipwrecks associated with the transatlantic slave trade. And our partners here from the University of Dakar, Cheikh Anta Diop University, are 6 graduate students. All of them are doctoral candidates in archaeology. Their professor on the left, who is a world-renowned scholar of African Atlantic studies. They are currently diving off of Gorée Island to identify a ship, one of 3 that is in that location, where we might exchange artifacts that they would have in their museum exhibitions, we would have in ours on a revolving basis. We're already doing this work in South Africa, in Cape Town. A ship called the São José has already been excavated. That will be the first ship that we document with Ezekiel Museums. We're working also in Cuba, in St. Croix, in the state of Florida, in Biscayne Bay, and looking forward to other projects. And when I was coming here, I was approached initially by 3 of your Afro-Argentinian organizations that are here, right here in Buenos Aires. And I had the pleasure of being introduced to them by Americo 5 years ago, and they are moving forward with what they are doing. They also are now convinced that they must join TIPA and join all of you to be successful in any way. Another initiative that we have is the Center for African American Media Arts. And one of our first initiatives is to collect home movies and videos from families around the nation. These are collections that demonstrate how we document ourselves, our family history, our family memory. And what we will do is take those videos, take that film, much of it from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, digitize it, and return the originals as well as a digital copy to the families. This began just recently in terms of a collecting initiative, but it's a permanent feature of the museum. Another one of our collaborative initiatives was saving, what we call Save Our African American Treasures. We realized very early on that many people did not think that they had material worthy of a Smithsonian institution. And this initiative began also with a church that burned to the ground in 2006 in Chicago, Pilgrim Baptist Church. When we realized that their records, their archives, their furnitures, their photographs, everything was completely destroyed. And we began an initiative that has gone around the country so far to 20 sites and will continue, where we work in collaboration with local conservators, local educators, local communities, in really demonstrating how they can better take care of these treasures as we reference them. We have not used this as a collecting initiative for us. We encourage people to take care of these materials, and if they cannot, to have them taken care of by their own local institutions. One of the issues that we deal with in terms of talking about the history of slavery, and then of course the second 100 years of enforced segregation, a system established so that the status quo would not change, we recognize that segregation did not apply only to us. So much of our work with indigenous communities, with Mexican American and other communities, is to really connect with how these forms of discrimination, of shame, of limitation, were a national phenomenon for us, not only for African Americans. And much of our collaborative work is with the Center for Latino Studies, for instance, at the Smithsonian, where we are exchanging, sharing, co-developing programs. Our Black Lives Matter initiative, collecting initiative, has been led by 3 of our key curators here, although there are others involved. It is something that we have begun documenting, collecting, et cetera, but we will continue as this social movement moves forward. While there is this historic phenomenon that many people are familiar with, and this is a photograph, these are photographs that were the booking photographs of a young woman who was 18 at the time, arrested in Jackson, Mississippi, for being part of a civil rights demonstration. And when they would book you, they would take these photos, and then she was put in Parchman Prison, one of the worst prisons in the United States. There were hundreds of young, especially young people, who were part of that. And this is this woman today. One of the things that we have begun to understand from the most recent civil rights movement is that if young people are engaged in activism of any sort in their youth, it becomes a lifelong characteristic. And so this is something, whether it's civil rights issues, political issues, equity around health, environmental justice, this is something that we very much encourage and work with in communities around the country, with our educators and with other community organizations. This kind of activism, and we see it in many people who were grade school children in the 1950s, high school or university students in the 1960s, they have a very high rate, over 90%, of continuing activism in this way. We also remind our audiences that those activists were not necessarily only African American. There were hundreds of whites, Jewish Americans, and others who were part of that movement then and now. We also work in collaboration with individual locales that tell the stories of what that meant in their specific community. In this case, in North Carolina, and one of the court cases that became clustered with others that ended in the Brown versus the Board of Education decision in 1954 that formally desegregated schools. It didn't desegregate schools in reality, but it was the beginning of a process. Some of our documentation around Black Lives Matter is ongoing now. This young girl is approximately 8 years old, and this was actually documented in Baltimore, a sister city to Washington, D.C. And so our curators have been collecting and participating in many of these issues. It's a national issue and has gone international. And finally, of course, we, in addition to referencing historically the Black press, the African American press, which has been huge and national from the early 19th century, we really talk about the election of President Barack Obama and what that meant in terms of struggle. This is actually a photograph that was taken before in Chicago, before he went on the road for campaigning. And these are ministers, men and women, who basically created a collective prayer of safety to bless him because of the dangers that he would be encountering as part of this campaign. So this is not just a presidential story on one level, it is how our communities have participated politically, socially, in fundraising, in political process. And it has international implications. This Bobby is in London. I'm going to be showing a fly-through of our building, but this is presently where our museum building stands in construction. This photograph is approximately a month old. And it is inspired by a number of architectural features. The porch, which we consider a seminal architectural feature of African American community, a shape, and actually this sort of tiered shape, which comes from a particular a particular Yoruba sculpture, and the shape was something that was an architectural feature of his work that had great symbolism. Our architectural teams are really 4 or 5 firms, led by design architect David Ajay, as well as Phil Freelon and his firm, which has a history of building some 20 plus African American museums. While we have some renderings here of the interior, I'm going to provide, in a sense, a moving fly-through that gives you a sense of the focus of the museum. While it is an early rendering or an early expression, it also really makes the point that our museum was developed by gathering thousands upon thousands of stories.